3 kings, 60 years, not one died peacefully, and it all started with murder in a cell that nobody was supposed to talk about. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something spicier than you might expect. A story of betrayal, madness, and blood-soaked crowns. The House of Lancaster. You've probably heard the name whispered in history class or seen it dramatised on screen. But what you don't know is how brutal, how desperate, and how utterly cursed this family really was. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A cousin murdered a king in a cold stone cell where no one could hear him scream. The body was displayed for all of London to see, face exposed, proof of death. But what nobody knew was that the murder had triggered something worse, a curse that would devour 3 generations of kings. Every single heir would either go mad, die young, or watch their kingdom collapse into civil war. That murdered king was Richard II, anointed by God, crowned in gold, abandoned by everyone who'd sworn to protect him. The man who took his throne was Henry Bolingbroke, Henry IV, the first Lancastrian king. But the crown he stole came with a price, written in blood, paid in madness, collected across 3 generations of absolute horror. This wasn't a dynasty. It was a funeral procession stretched across 60 years, 3 kings, all of them cursed, and we're going to walk through every brutal moment. The House of Lancaster didn't begin with Henry IV. It began decades earlier with his father, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, son of Edward III, one of the most powerful men in medieval England. His name alone made nobles tremble. His wealth rivaled the crowns. His armies could challenge kings. But here's the thing about John of Gaunt. He would never be king. Never. He was the 3rd surviving son, close enough to taste power, close enough to smell it, but never close enough to hold it. And that proximity to the throne, without the ability to claim it, poisoned his bloodline for generations. Edward III had been glorious. Victories in France, Crécy, Poitiers, the French king himself captured and paraded through London. But success created a problem. Too many sons, 7 legitimate sons who survived infancy, each one ambitious, each one watching the throne with hungry eyes, each one building power bases and private armies. It was a powder keg. The eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, was everything a medieval heir should be, a warrior legend. He embodied chivalric ideals, brave in battle, generous to allies, absolutely merciless to enemies. He was beloved by common people, feared across Europe, destined for greatness, the perfect future king. But in 1376, before his father died, the Black Prince fell ill. Some chronicles say dysentery, others suggest cancer. Whatever killed him, it was slow and agonising. This great warrior, this symbol of English might, reduced to a hollow shell wasting away in bed. He died at 45, and his death shattered England's expectations for the future. The Black Prince left behind a son, Richard, born 1367, a delicate, artistic boy who loved poetry and fashion and architecture. He had no interest in war, no stomach for the brutal realities of medieval combat. In a world where kingship meant leading armies and personally executing justice with a sword, Richard was fundamentally unsuited for the crown. But he had the one thing that mattered in medieval succession: legitimate royal blood, the right bloodline. And that meant everything. John of Gaunt became the power behind young Richard's throne during his minority. Not officially regent, that honour went to councils and committees, all the political theatre of shared governance. But everyone knew where real power lived. John had the money. Lancaster estates were vast, sprawling across England, generating income that rivaled or exceeded the crown's revenue. He had the connections. His marriages had linked him to half the royal houses of Europe, And he had military power, private armies loyal to Lancaster, not the crown. For over a decade, John of Gaunt essentially ruled England, while Richard grew from confused child to resentful teenager to paranoid young man. And Richard watched it all. Watched his uncle accumulate power that should have been royal prerogative. Watched him make decisions, command armies, shape policy. And he grew to hate John with a passion that simmered for years, even though John never technically betrayed him, never actually reached for the crown itself. John of Gaunt built his power through strategic marriages that were masterclasses in medieval politics. His first wife, Blanche of Lancaster, died of plague in 1368. She'd been the heiress to the Lancaster fortune, and through her death, John inherited one of the richest titles in England. The chroniclers record him genuinely grieving, commissioning elaborate tombs, funding endless prayers for her soul. But grief didn't stop ambition. It never does when you're that close to ultimate power. His second marriage was pure calculation, cold, strategic. Constance of Castile was the daughter of King Peter the Cruel of Castile, who'd been murdered and usurped. Through Constance, John claimed the throne of Castile. Just claimed it. Started styling himself King of Castile and Leon, and spent years bleeding English money and men trying to make that fantasy real. He launched military expeditions to Spain. He negotiated with Portuguese and Aragonese allies. He dreamed of being a king in his own right, not just a duke, not just the power behind someone else's throne, but it never worked. The Spanish nobility, Haiti rejected him. The campaigns failed. John's Spanish crown remained pure fantasy, a title that meant nothing except to his own pride. And then there was Catherine Swynford. She'd entered John's household as governess to his daughters. She was beautiful, intelligent, accomplished in all the courtly arts, and she was from a minor Flemish, knightly family, utterly unsuitable as a mistress for one of the greatest lords in Christendom. But John fell in love. Not political calculation this time, actual love. Catherine became his mistress while he was still married to Constance, carrying on an affair that scandalised the court and gave the gossips endless material. She bore him 4 children over the years: John, Henry, Thomas, and Joan Beaufort. Bastards. Beautiful, talented, intelligent bastards. When Constance died in 1394, John did something that shocked England to its core. He married Catherine, his third wife, a woman who'd been his mistress for over a decade. The scandal was enormous. Dukes didn't marry their mistresses, especially not women of Catherine's relatively low birth. But John was 64 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and utterly done with political marriages. He married the woman he loved, and then he did something even more shocking, something that would echo through English history for over a century. He pressured his nephew, King Richard II, to legitimise his Beaufort children. In 1397, Richard issued letters patent legitimising them. Royal decree made them legitimate members of the royal family. They could inherit property now, hold titles, be recognised as nobles. It was unprecedented. Bastards elevated to nobility by the stroke of a pen. But there was a catch. A single Latin phrase that created a wound in English politics that would fester for generations. Accepta dignitate regali. Accept royal dignity. The Beauforts could be nobles, but they could never ever claim the throne. That clause would haunt England, because the Beauforts never accepted it, never forgot it, never stopped believing they had as much right to power as anyone else, and they never stopped scheming, positioning, manoeuvring themselves closer to the throne that was supposedly forever beyond their reach. John of Gaunt's legitimate son, Henry Bolingbroke, grew up watching all of this. Born 1367, the same year as his cousin Richard. They should have been friends, allies, brothers in arms. Instead, they became rivals locked in a spiral neither could escape. Henry was everything Richard wasn't: athletic, charismatic, completely comfortable in armour and on horseback. He excelled at tournaments across Europe, winning competitions and building a reputation as a skilled warrior. He went on crusade to Prussia with the Teutonic Knights, fighting pagans in the freezing Baltic, earning glory and proving his martial prowess. He was admired, respected, even loved by the English nobility. He was competent, decisive, strong, and that made Richard absolutely terrified, because competence is threatening when you lack it yourself. As Richard grew into his kingship through his teens and 20s, he became increasingly autocratic, paranoid, desperate to prove he was in control. He'd survived the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, when rebels stormed London demanding an end to serfdom, and killed several royal advisors in the streets. 14-year-old Richard had faced the rebels personally at Smithfield, promising reforms, speaking brave words, narrowly escaping with his life when violence erupted. The experience traumatized him, shaped everything that came after. He learned that his position was fragile, that common people could rise up and murder nobles, that his own nobility couldn't always protect him, that he was vulnerable in ways his father and grandfather never had been. By the 1390s, Richard had developed a court culture of absolute submission that bordered on the pathological. He demanded his nobles bow before him, not just respectfully, but prostrate themselves like subjects before an Eastern potentate. He wore elaborate robes that cost fortunes, each one more extravagant than the last. He insisted on ceremonies that emphasized his divine right, his direct connection to God, his absolute authority over every aspect of governance. He created a group of young favourites, the Continual Council, who owed everything to him and would never question his decisions. Yes-men, sycophants, people who told him what he wanted to hear and isolated him from reality. And he began seeing threats everywhere, especially from his powerful uncles who dominated his minority. John of Gaunt, still immensely wealthy and connected, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, and Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, who openly criticised Richard's policies and gathered malcontents around him like flies to rot. In 1397, Richard made his move. Brutal, decisive, final. He arrested Gloucester, Arundel and Warwick, 3 senior nobles who'd opposed him years earlier, who'd tried to control him, who'd questioned his authority. The trials were shams, the verdicts predetermined by royal intimidation. Arundel was beheaded publicly, his execution a message to anyone who dared challenge royal authority. Warwick was exiled, stripped of lands and titles and power. Gloucester disappeared into custody at Calais and was found dead shortly after. The official story was natural causes, but everyone knew he'd been murdered on Richard's orders. The king confiscated their lands and titles, redistributing the wealth to his favourites. England was shocked into silence. Richard had shown he would kill his own family to maintain power, kill his own blood without hesitation or remorse. The nobility watched and wondered who would be next, whose lands Richard would covet, who would disappear into a cell and never emerge. That brings us to 1398, the year everything started unravelling. A dispute erupted between Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. The details are murky, lost to conflicting accounts and political spin, but Henry accused Mowbray of treason, specifically of plotting against the king and of being involved in Gloucester's death. Mowbray denied everything, insisted he was loyal, claimed Henry was lying to advance his own position. Richard, seeing an opportunity to rid himself of 2 potential threats at once, ordered trial by combat. Medieval justice at its finest. The 2 men would fight to the death. God would decide who was telling the truth through violence. The combat was scheduled for September 16th, 1398, at Coventry. Thousands gathered to watch. This was entertainment and justice combined, the biggest spectacle England had seen in years. Elaborate stands were built for nobility, Merchants came from miles around. Commoners packed the viewing areas. The two champions mounted their horses, armour gleaming in the sun, lances ready for the charge. The tension was enormous. The crowd roared in anticipation, and then at the last possible moment, just as the signal was about to be given, Richard threw down his staff, stopped the combat before blood could be shed. Then he announced his judgment, and it was designed for maximum political impact. Both men were banished from England. Mowbray for life, Henry for 10 years. It was political theatre designed to humiliate both men while demonstrating Richard's absolute power over even the highest nobles. Look what I can do. I can stop divine judgment itself. I can banish you on a whim. I am above the law. I am the law. Henry Bolingbroke, stunned and furious but powerless to resist, left England for France. He had no choice. Defying the king meant immediate death, and Richard had made it clear he wouldn't hesitate to execute even close family members. But Richard wasn't finished with Henry. Not even close. In February 1399, John of Gaunt died. He was 58, worn out by decades of political manoeuvring, military campaigns, and the sheer exhausting reality of living so close to ultimate power without ever holding it. On his deathbed, John reportedly begged Richard to reduce Henry's exile and allow his son to inherit the Lancaster estates. It was a reasonable request. Henry was John's legitimate heir, and property rights were sacred in feudal society. Richard agreed, promised, gave his word as king. Then, the moment John was dead and couldn't hold him accountable, Richard broke his promise, shattered it completely. He seized the entire Lancaster inheritance, every castle, every manor, every source of income, every piece of property John had accumulated over a lifetime. Gone, confiscated, royal property now. And he extended Henry's exile from 10 years to life. Permanent banishment. Henry Bolingbroke was now a man with nothing. No land, no money, no future in England, no hope of inheritance, stripped of everything by a paranoid king who saw threats in every shadow. Richard thought he'd neutralised the threat permanently, that he'd cut it off at the root and made Henry powerless forever. What Richard didn't understand, what he couldn't understand, because he'd never had to fight for anything, was that he'd just given Henry the perfect justification for rebellion. Because in the feudal world, property rights were sacred, more sacred than the king's authority in many ways. A lord could expect to pass his lands to his legitimate heir. That was the foundation of the entire feudal system. Richard had violated that fundamental principle, and every nobleman in England watched what Richard had done and wondered, if the king could steal Lancaster's inheritance on a whim, whose estates would be next? Whose lands would Richard confiscate? Richard had made himself a threat to everyone who owned property, everyone who had something to lose. In May 1909, Richard made another catastrophic decision. He left England for Ireland to deal with some rebellious lords causing trouble there. He planned to be gone for months, taking a significant portion of his military forces with him. It was the worst possible timing. Because in July 1399, Henry Bolingbroke landed in Yorkshire with a small force, a few dozen ships, maybe 300 men initially. Officially, he claimed he only wanted his inheritance back, his father's lands, his birthright. Nothing more. Just give me what's rightfully mine, and I'll go home peacefully. But the nobles who rode to join him knew better. This wasn't about property anymore. This was about stopping a king who'd proven he would murder, steal, and destroy anyone who challenged his authority or stood in his way. Within weeks, Henry's army swelled to thousands. Lords who'd watched Richard's tyranny with growing alarm saw their chance. The Percy family rode south with their armies. The Earl of Northumberland, the most powerful man in the north, and his son Hotspur, England's greatest warrior. They brought thousands of experienced soldiers, men loyal to Percy, not the crown. Other lords joined, some out of loyalty to Lancaster, some out of hatred for Richard, some because they recognised which way the wind was blowing and wanted to be on the winning side. Richard's supporters melted away like snow in summer. His army in Ireland refused to return quickly enough. They'd heard about Henry's growing forces and decided this wasn't a fight they wanted. His remaining loyalists in England abandoned him when they saw the size of Henry's army. Some switched sides openly, publicly declaring for Henry. Others just disappeared, went home, decided this wasn't their problem. Richard sailed back from Ireland in August and found his kingdom in revolt. Everything he'd built, all his carefully constructed authority, collapsed in weeks. He tried to raise an army in Wales but failed spectacularly. The Welsh had no particular loyalty to this English king and saw no reason to die for him. He retreated to Conwy Castle in North Wales, desperately hoping to negotiate some kind of settlement, to find some way out of this nightmare. Henry sent the Earl of Northumberland to offer terms. "Come to a meeting, we'll discuss your grievances, we can resolve this peacefully like reasonable men." Richard, abandoned and out of options, agreed. He left Conwy Castle for the meeting. It was a trap. When Richard arrived, Henry's forces arrested him. Just arrested the anointed King of England, chosen by God, crowned with all the sacred oils and ceremonies, taken prisoner by his own cousin. Richard was brought to Chester, then to London, held in various castles as Henry consolidated power and prepared for the next step. He was moved like a chess piece, a prisoner in his own kingdom. September 29th, 1399. Richard was brought to the Tower of London and forced to abdicate. They made him sign documents renouncing the crown, admitting he was unfit to rule, surrendering all royal authority. Richard wept. He begged. He pleaded for mercy, for his life, for some kind of future. He signed the papers because what else could he do? He had no army, no supporters, no options. Just sign, and maybe you'll be allowed to live quietly somewhere. Maybe this doesn't have to end in blood, but everyone knew it would end in blood. It had to. The next day, October 13th, 1399, Henry Bolingbroke claimed the throne as Henry IV, not through legitimate inheritance. Technically, Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, descended from Edward III's second son through the female line, had a better hereditary claim. But through conquest, through force, through the simple reality of might making right, Henry presented himself to Parliament and claimed the throne by right of descent, a weak claim through John of Gaunt, and by right of conquest, the actual reason. Parliament, intimidated by Henry's army and recognising political reality, accepted him. They didn't have much choice. Henry IV was crowned King of England on October 13, 1399, the first Lancastrian king, but also the first English king since William the Conqueror to take the throne by deposing his predecessor. That broke something fundamental in English political culture. The idea that kingship was sacred, ordained by God, inviolable. Henry had proven that idea was a lie. Crowns could be taken by force. Divine right meant nothing without an army to back it up. And as long as Richard lived, imprisoned somewhere, he remained a threat, a focus for rebellion, a legitimate king in chains. People could rally around him. Lords who regretted supporting Henry could switch sides and claim they were restoring the rightful king. Rebellions started almost immediately. In January 1400, a group of Richard's former supporters, the Epiphany Rising, plotted to murder Henry during a tournament and restore Richard. The plot was discovered before it could be executed. The rebels were hunted down and killed, their heads displayed on London Bridge as a warning to anyone else considering rebellion. But the message was clear. England hadn't fully accepted the usurpation. As long as Richard lived, Henry would never be secure, never sleep soundly, never stop looking over his shoulder, waiting for the knife. Richard II was moved to Pontefract Castle in Yorkshire, a royal fortress but remote, isolated, far from London, easy to control, easy to make someone disappear. And there in February 1400, Richard died. The official story was convenient and implausible. Richard had refused food. Grief and despair over losing his throne had driven him to starve himself to death. He died peacefully, accepting his fate, no violence involved. Just melancholy. The official story was a lie that nobody believed. The truth, whispered in chronicles and hinted at in reports from horrified servants who'd been at Pontefract, was far darker. Richard was murdered. Some sources suggest he was beaten to death by his jailers, struck repeatedly with clubs until his skull cracked. Others claim he was suffocated with a cushion, held down while he struggled until he stopped moving. One chronicle mentions an axe to the back of the head. Quick, brutal, final. The method doesn't really matter. What matters is that an anointed king, a man who'd ruled England for 22 years, died in a cold cell in Yorkshire, alone, terrified, probably crying out for help that never came. And Henry IV had his blood on his hands. Directly or indirectly, and probably directly, Richard's death was Henry's responsibility. Henry's sin, Henry's curse, Richard's body was brought south and displayed in London. Shown publicly at St. Paul's Cathedral, face exposed, so people could see with their own eyes that he was truly dead, that this wasn't a trick or a substitution. But even seeing the corpse wasn't enough to stop the rumours. Whispers persisted for years that Richard wasn't really dead, that the body was a substitute, that the real Richard had escaped and was hiding in Scotland or France, waiting for his moment to return and reclaim his throne. Henry spent years crushing these rumours, executing anyone who spread them, hunting down pretenders who claimed to be Richard returned. But the ghost of Richard II haunted Henry until his own death. That ghost would never leave, never let him rest, never allow him peace. The curse had been set in motion, and it would consume everything the Lancastrians touched. Henry IV's reign was cursed from the first day. Absolutely cursed. Within months of his coronation, rebellions erupted across the kingdom like boils on infected flesh. The first major threat came from the very family who'd helped put him on the throne, the Percys. The Percys were the most powerful family in northern England. The Earl of Northumberland and his son, Henry Hotspur Percy, England's greatest warrior, famous across Europe, had been instrumental in Henry's usurpation. They'd raised armies, they'd fought Richard's supporters, they'd risked everything for the Lancastrian cause, and they expected to be rewarded generously. Lands, titles, money, power, recognition for the role they'd played. Instead, Henry kept them at arm's length. He gave them some honours, some titles, but nothing like what they'd expected or felt they deserved. Worse, much worse, the Percys were responsible for defending the Scottish border, and that was an expensive proposition. They spent their own money raising armies, fighting Scottish raids, maintaining castles and garrisons. They expected the crown to reimburse them for these costs. Henry's treasury was empty, bled dry by rebellion and the costs of securing his stolen throne. He couldn't pay them, wouldn't pay them, made excuses and promises he had no intention of keeping. The Percys, insulted and going broke defending England's borders, started to regret backing Henry, started to wonder if they'd made a terrible mistake putting this man on the throne. In July 1403, Hotspur decided he'd had enough. Maybe Henry wasn't the right king after all. Maybe Edmund Mortimer, the young Earl of March who had that better hereditary claim, should be king. Or maybe, and this is where it gets really twisted, maybe Hotspur himself should rule. The sources disagree on his exact motivation, but what's clear is that Hotspur raised an army and marched south to overthrow the king he'd helped create just 4 years earlier. Henry responded with shocking speed and decisiveness. He gathered his forces and marched north to intercept Hotspur before he could link up with other rebels and become truly dangerous. The two armies met at Shrewsbury on July 21st, 1403. What followed was one of the most savage battles of the medieval period, brutal, exhausting, decisive. Hotspur's forces included some of the best soldiers in England. veterans of Scottish wars, professional men-at-arms who'd spent years fighting. These weren't farmers with pitchforks, these were hardened warriors. Henry's forces included his eldest son, Prince Henry, the future Henry V, who was only 16 years old, a boy leading men in battle. The battle lasted for hours, vicious hand-to-hand combat. Arrows darkened the sky in volleys. Knights charged and hacked at each other with swords and axes. Men slipped in mud and blood. The fighting was so intense that chroniclers described it as one of the bloodiest battles anyone could remember. And at one point during this chaos, during this hell of violence and screaming, Prince Henry was struck in the face by an arrow. The bolt hit just below his left eye and lodged deep in his skull, the arrowhead penetrating several inches into bone. By all logic, by all medical understanding, he should have died instantly. Should have collapsed, his brain damaged, dead before he hit the ground. Instead, this 16-year-old boy refused to leave the battlefield. Blood poured down his face, hot and sticky, getting in his mouth, his remaining eye swelling from trauma. His commanders begged him to retreat, to get medical attention, told him he was going to die if he didn't leave. Immediately, he refused, kept fighting, kept giving orders, kept inspiring the men around him to hold the line. The sight of the wounded prince refusing to retreat, refusing to show weakness, refusing to give Hotspur the satisfaction of seeing him fall, rallied Henry's forces. It gave them courage, made them fight harder. This boy with an arrow in his face was braver than they were. How could they do less? Hotspur was killed during the battle. Some sources say he was struck down in single combat with a royal knight. Others say he was overwhelmed by multiple attackers, dragged from his horse and hacked to death. Either way, England's greatest warrior died in a muddy field in Shropshire, fighting against the king he'd helped create. The rebels broke when they saw Hotspur fall. Many fled. Those who surrendered were shown absolutely no mercy. Hotspur's body was beheaded and quartered, the pieces sent to different cities across England as a warning. This is what happens to traitors, to those who challenge the king. His head was stuck on a pike at York's main gate. The Earl of Northumberland, Hotspur's father, who'd stayed out of the battle, hedging his bets, was forced to see his son's body displayed like a common criminal's. Forced to witness what happened when you backed the wrong side and then tried to correct your mistake. Young Prince Henry's wound should have killed him through infection, even if the initial trauma didn't. Arrow wounds to the head were almost always fatal in medieval times. But the prince had access to the best medical care available in England. A royal surgeon named John Bradmore treated him, and Bradmore was a genius. He invented a custom tool, basically a specialized set of hollow tongs, specifically designed to extract the arrowhead without destroying Henry's skull in the process. The surgery took hours. Henry was conscious throughout, held down by strong men, while Bradmore dug into his face with metal instruments, probing the wound, searching for the arrowhead lodged deep in bone. The agony must have been unimaginable. No anesthesia, no way to numb the pain, just pure medieval surgery. The wound was then flushed with wine and packed with honey, which has natural antibacterial properties. Miraculously, against all odds, it didn't become infected. Henry survived, but the scar ran down his face for the rest of his life, from eye to jaw, a permanent reminder that kingship was paid for in blood and pain and suffering. That survival meant enduring horror. But the Percy Rebellion was just the beginning of Henry IV's nightmare reign. The Earl of Northumberland tried again in 1405, raising another rebellion, gathering more malcontents who hated Henry. It was crushed. Northumberland fled to Scotland. In 1408 he tried one more time, invading from Scotland with a small army of desperate men. He was killed at the Battle of Bramham Moor, cut down by royal forces. 3 generations of Percys destroyed because they'd backed the wrong king and then tried to correct their mistake. And then there was Wales. God, Wales! Owain Glyndor's rebellion, turned Wales into an absolute nightmare for English control and lasted over a decade. Glyndwr was a Welsh nobleman with legitimate grievances against English courts that consistently ruled against Welsh litigants. In 1400, frustrated and insulted, he declared himself Prince of Wales. Not a rebel asking for reforms, not a subject petitioning his king, a prince claiming sovereignty in his own right. Glyndwr's rebellion spread through Wales like wildfire through dry timber. The Welsh, oppressed by discriminatory English laws that treated them as second-class subjects in their own country, flocked to his banner by the thousands. Within months, much of Wales was in open revolt. English castles were besieged. English settlers were driven out or murdered. Towns burned. The Welsh attacked with guerrilla tactics, perfected over generations, ambushes in narrow valleys, raids on supply lines, hit-and-run attacks that left English armies frustrated and demoralised. Glyndwr himself became a legend almost overnight. Stories spread that he could control the weather, that he'd called up storms to destroy English armies, that he could become invisible, that he was the fulfilment of ancient Welsh prophecies about a prince who would drive the English out forever and restore Welsh independence. Henry IV sent army after army into Wales. All of them failed, every single one. The terrain favoured defenders, mountains, forests, valleys where ambushes were invisible until arrows started falling. The Welsh knew every mountain pass, every hidden trail, every secret route that bypassed English strongpoints. English armies would march into Wales in strength, flags flying, confident they'd crush the rebellion quickly, and they'd limp back weeks later in defeat, having accomplished nothing except wasting enormous amounts of money and losing men to ambushes and disease. Glyndwr established a Welsh parliament at Machynlleth, made alliances with France and Scotland, both eager to cause problems for England, had himself crowned in elaborate ceremonies that mimicked English royal coronations. For a brief, glorious period, Wales was effectively independent, with Glyndwr as its acknowledged prince. The English response was brutal beyond measure. Prince Henry, recovering from his wound at Shrewsbury, was given command of operations in Wales when he was barely out of his teens. He'd proven himself in battle, and more importantly, he understood something his father's other commanders hadn't grasped. This wasn't a war you could win with pitched battles. This was a war of attrition, of making rebellion so economically destructive, so painful to everyday Welsh life, that people would eventually stop supporting it out of sheer exhaustion. Prince Henry implemented a scorched earth policy that would have made William Tecumseh Sherman proud. Villages suspected of supporting Glyndwr were burned to the ground, every building destroyed, every structure levelled. Crops were destroyed systematically, grain fields torched before harvest, orchards cut down, vineyards ripped up by the roots. Livestock was slaughtered wholesale, thousands of cattle and sheep killed not for food, but purely to starve the Welsh population. Prisoners were executed without trial, often hanged in public, as warnings to anyone considering supporting the rebellion. The goal wasn't to defeat Glyndwr militarily, it was to make rebellion so painful, so destructive to ordinary Welsh life, that the common people would stop supporting him. And it worked, but it took over a decade of grinding, brutal warfare that left Wales economically devastated and traumatised for generations. Slowly, through economic pressure and military grinding and sheer exhaustion, the rebellion was suppressed. Glyndwr's support crumbled as the Welsh realised they couldn't sustain a long war against English resources and ruthlessness. His French allies abandoned him when they needed to focus on their own problems. His Scottish support dried up when the Scots made peace with England. Castles were retaken one by one, garrisons restored, English control re-established. By 1415, the rebellion was effectively over. Wales was broken, but Glyndwr himself was never captured. Never. Despite years of hunting, despite enormous rewards, offered for his capture, dead or alive, he disappeared, probably into the mountains of North Wales, sheltered by loyal followers who'd rather die than betray him. Some say he died in hiding, old and exhausted, sometime around 1415. Others claim he lived out his days in secret, protected until the end, dying peacefully despite everything. His body was never found. The English wanted desperately to put his head on a spike in London, to show that rebellion ended in death and humiliation and public display. Instead, Glyndwr became a legend, the last native Prince of Wales who defied England and vanished into myth. And Prince Henry, he learned brutal lessons in Wales that would shape his entire future reign. He learned that mercy was weakness in warfare, that enemies needed to be crushed completely and utterly, ground down until resistance became impossible. That kingship meant making hard, cruel decisions and living with the consequences without flinching or showing remorse. The boy who'd taken an arrow to the face at Shrewsbury became a man who understood war in all its horror, all its brutality, all its absolute necessity. Those lessons would make him one of England's greatest warrior kings, but they'd also make him ruthless in ways that still shock modern readers. While young Prince Henry campaigned in Wales, learning to be ruthless, his father was literally falling apart. Henry IV had always been physically robust, strong, healthy, active in tournaments. But starting around 1406, his body turned against him in the most horrific way imaginable. He developed a skin disease that chroniclers described with disgust and horror. They called it leprosy, though modern historians think it was more likely severe psoriasis, eczema, or possibly tertiary syphilis. Whatever the actual medical cause, the symptoms were nightmarish beyond description. His face erupted in pustules and sores that wept constantly, leaving him in perpetual discomfort. His skin cracked and bled, particularly around the joints and on his face. Boils covered his body, bursting and reforming in an endless cycle of agony. The smell was reportedly terrible, the stench of rotting flesh, of infection, of a body consuming itself. He couldn't appear in public without causing horror and revulsion. People recoiled from him, crossing themselves, backing away, as if his disease might be contagious through proximity alone. Some whispered it was divine punishment, God's judgment for deposing and murdering Richard II, God marking him, making his sins visible on his flesh for all to see. The guilt and the disease feeding on each other, creating a spiral of physical and psychological torment. Henry couldn't bear to be seen. He consulted every physician available, trying every treatment medieval medicine could offer, bloodletting to balance his humours, herbal poultices applied to the sores, prayers and blessings from every holy man in England. Nothing worked, nothing even helped. His body continued to rot slowly, agonisingly, while he tried desperately to maintain control of a kingdom that was slipping through his diseased fingers. The disease wasn't just physical, it poisoned his mind as well. Henry became paranoid, convinced enemies were plotting against him in every shadow, seeing conspiracy and betrayal everywhere he looked. He quarrelled constantly with Prince Henry, who was increasingly taking over the day-to-day governance of England because his father was too sick to rule effectively, too disfigured to appear before Parliament, too broken to maintain the image of kingly authority. Father and son circled each other like wounded animals, the old king dying slowly, clinging to his stolen crown with what remained of his strength. The young prince waiting, not exactly patiently, for his father to die so he could finally rule without interference. The sources hint at serious conflict between them. Rumours spread, never fully proven but widely believed, that Prince Henry tried to force his father to abdicate, that he showed up to council meetings with armed men to intimidate the old king, that he even tried on the crown while his father was still alive, seeing how it felt, imagining his reign. In 1413, while praying in Westminster Abbey, Still trying to find peace with God? Still trying to make amends for Richard's murder? Henry IV collapsed. He was carried to the Jerusalem chamber, a room in the abbey named for its decorative tapestries, showing scenes from the Holy Land. And there he died on March 20th, 1413. He was only 45 years old, but disease and stress and guilt had aged him terribly. He looked ancient, rotted, exhausted. An old prophecy had claimed Henry would die in Jerusalem. He'd assumed it meant the Holy Land, that he'd die on crusade fighting Muslims, redeeming his sins through holy war against the infidels. The prophecy that would wash away Richard's blood and restore his soul. Instead, he died in a room named Jerusalem in London, far from redemption, far from the glory he'd imagined when he stole the throne 14 years earlier. His body was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, not Westminster Abbey, where kings were supposed to rest beside their predecessors. The burial was quiet, unremarkable, attended by relatively few nobles. England didn't mourn Henry IV's death. They were too busy wondering what would happen next, what the scarred young king with the reputation for ruthlessness would do with absolute power. The curse had taken its first victim. Henry IV had ruled for 14 years of absolute misery, fighting rebellions, watching his body decay, never finding peace. He'd stolen a throne and paid for it with his flesh. But his son would be different. Henry V would be glorious, a warrior king, a conqueror, or so everyone thought. Henry V became king on March 21st, 1413, and overnight everything changed. The transformation was absolute and immediate. The wild prince, the tavern-goer, the young man who'd supposedly spent his youth drinking with low companions, Shakespeare's Prince Hal carousing with Falstaff, all of that vanished like morning fog. Gone, as if it had never existed. Henry dismissed his old friends without ceremony or explanation, just sent them away, never spoke to them again. He became intensely pious, attending church services daily, consulting with bishops on every major decision, presenting himself as God's chosen instrument on earth. He was disciplined to the point of obsession, focused entirely on governance and military planning, consumed by visions of glory and divine mission. And he understood something fundamental about medieval kingship that his father had never quite grasped. The best way to unite a fractured kingdom, to heal the wounds of civil war and rebellion, was to give England a common enemy, someone to hate, someone to fight, someone to unite against: France, the old enemy, the eternal rival. Henry's claim to the French throne was based on a technicality so absurd it would be laughable if he hadn't had an army to back it up. His great-great-grandmother Isabella of France had been the daughter of a French king. Through this woman who died in 1358, over 60 years earlier, Henry argued he had a better claim to the French throne than the current French king, Charles VI. The problem? French law explicitly forbade inheritance through the female line. The Salic law, supposedly based on ancient Frankish tribal customs, was absolute and unbreakable. Women couldn't inherit the crown, and neither could their descendants ever, under any circumstances. But Henry insisted the Salic law was invalid, that it was a recent invention created specifically to keep English kings from claiming France, that his claim was legitimate and righteous and blessed by God himself, that he was, by right, King of France, and the current occupant, Charles VI, who was intermittently insane, was a usurper. The French rejected this claim with the scorn it probably deserved. Charles VI was king, even if he sometimes thought he was made of glass or didn't recognise his own wife. His son, the Dauphin Charles, was the heir, some English nobleman claiming the throne through a great-great-grandmother dead for over half a century was ridiculous, absurd, not even worth discussing seriously. But Henry didn't care about French opinions. He presented outrageous demands to the French court, massive territorial concessions, essentially every piece of land England had ever held in France plus more. payment of unpaid ransoms from previous wars dating back decades, and marriage to Catherine of Valois, Charles VI's daughter, as a condition of peace. When the French refused, as Henry knew they would, as he was counting on them refusing because he wanted war, not negotiation, he declared them in breach of justice and prepared to take by force what he claimed was his by right. Henry spent months preparing for invasion. This wasn't a hasty decision or an impulsive military adventure. He rebuilt the English navy, which had rotted during his father's chaotic reign, spending fortunes on new ships and repairs. He secured loans from Parliament and the Church, promising them glory and plunder in France. He gathered an army of around 12,000 men, one of the largest English armies ever assembled for a foreign campaign. He stockpiled weapons, recruited the legendary English longbowmen from across the kingdom, hired foreign mercenaries to supplement his forces. This wasn't a raid. This was an invasion meant to conquer and hold territory permanently. In August 1415, Henry sailed for France with dreams of empire. His first target was Harfleur, a strategic port town in Normandy. Capturing it would give England a secure base on the French coast, a foothold for further operations. The siege began in mid-August and should have been quick and straightforward. Harfleur wasn't one of France's great fortresses. It was a moderately sized port with decent walls, but nothing that should have resisted a professional army for long. But Harfleur was well defended by a determined garrison that knew surrender meant harsh terms. They fought desperately. The siege dragged on week after week. Henry's forces dug trenches, built siege towers, bombarded the walls with cannons, relatively new weapons that made terrifying noise but weren't yet very effective at actually destroying fortifications. And during those brutal weeks while the English army sat outside Harfleur's walls, something started killing Henry's men, faster than any French garrison could. Dysentery, the medieval soldier's nightmare, the silent killer that destroyed more armies than battles ever did. It spread through the English camp like divine judgment. Dysentery starts with stomach cramps, uncomfortable but manageable. Then comes violent, bloody diarrhea that won't stop. Can't stop. Your body purging itself, expelling fluids faster than you can replace them. Dehydration follows rapidly, and in the August heat, with poor sanitation and contaminated water sources, you could go from healthy to dying in 72 hours. Men literally shit themselves to death in their tents, crying for water, too weak to stand, too weak even to crawl outside. The medical tents were overwhelmed almost immediately. Priests heard more confessions in those weeks than in some entire years, blessing men who knew they were dying and had no hope of recovery. Bodies were buried in mass graves outside the siege lines, thousands of them, the dead stacked on top of each other because there wasn't time or manpower to dig individual graves. When Harfleur finally surrendered on September 22nd, Henry's army was devastated. He'd lost thousands of men, some killed in the actual siege, but the vast majority dead from disease, rotting in graves that would never be properly marked. Even more were too sick to continue, barely able to walk, let alone fight. Henry had to garrison Harfleur with some of his healthy troops, further reducing his field army. By the time he began his march to Calais, the English-held port 120 miles north, he had perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 men. Most were exhausted from weeks of siege work. Many were still recovering from illness. All were short on supplies because the siege had consumed far more resources than planned. And the French army was gathering, growing stronger every day, preparing to crush him. Henry could have turned back, should have turned back by any rational calculation, could have sailed home from Harfleur, claimed victory, we captured a major French port, and prepared for another campaign the following year with a fresh, healthy army. But that wasn't how Henry thought. That wasn't who he was after Wales and Shrewsbury, and years of proving himself. He decided to march to Calais through hostile territory. It should have taken about 8 days with a healthy army. It took 2.5 weeks of nightmare marching through hell. The French harassed him constantly. They burned bridges, so the English had to detour. They blocked fords so they couldn't cross rivers easily. They forced exhausting detours that added miles to every day's march. Food supplies ran desperately low. The rationing became tighter each day. Men began to starve slowly, their strength failing, their bodies consuming themselves. The army was falling apart, discipline fraying at the edges, men deserting in the night. And then the French found them, at a place called Agincourt, a narrow field between two villages flanked by dense woods on both sides. October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, a date that would echo through English history and mythology for centuries. The English were trapped, no way forward except through the French army. Behind them was hostile territory and starvation. The French forces outnumbered them catastrophically, at least 3-1, possibly 4 or 5-1, depending on which chronicle you believe. The French had heavy cavalry, knights on massive war horses, trained from childhood for war, professional men-at-arms in the finest armour money could buy, plate steel that could turn aside swords and arrows, the flower of French nobility, veterans of campaigns across Europe. The French commanders were so confident of victory they actually argued among themselves over who would get the honour of capturing King Henry personally, who would get to parade him through Paris in chains, who would get the ransom money and the glory of defeating England's upstart king. The night before battle was terrible beyond description. It rained constantly, turning the recently ploughed field between the armies into thick, clinging mud that sucked at your boots with every step. The English camped in the open with no shelter, soaked through, cold, hungry, probably expecting to die the next day. They'd marched for weeks, they'd starved, they'd watched comrades die from disease. Now they faced an army that could crush them easily. Henry moved among his men in the darkness, speaking quietly, trying to maintain morale, telling them God was on their side. He knew the odds as well as anyone. This should be a massacre, but retreat was impossible. They'd have to fight their way through or die trying. There was no third option. The morning of October 25th came cold and wet and miserable. Henry positioned his army in a defensive formation at one end of the narrow field. Archers on both flanks, thousands of them, England's secret weapon, protected by sharpened stakes driven into the ground to stop cavalry charges. Men-at-arms in the centre, the most heavily armoured troops forming a solid defensive line. The French arrayed at the other end, packed tightly because of the narrow ground, hemmed in by woods on both sides. And then both armies just stood there in the rain and mud. For hours, nobody moving, nobody attacking. Neither side wanted to move first because whoever moved first would have to cross that muddy field and arrive exhausted at the enemy lines. The French expected the English to crack first, to charge desperately out of fear, or to try retreating. But Henry held firm, showing the patience he'd learned in Wales, the discipline that separated great commanders from merely good ones. Finally, mid-morning, Henry gave the order. Not a charge. A slow, deliberate advance, the English moved forward carefully, stopping about 300 yards from the French line, close enough that their arrows would be maximally effective, far enough that they could see the charge coming. And then the archers loosed their first volleys. The sky went dark, thousands of arrows blotting out what little sun broke through the clouds. That's when the French cavalry charged, and everything went catastrophically wrong for them almost immediately. The horses struggled in the thick mud, every step a battle against a suction that drained their strength. The sharpened stakes blocked their approach, creating barriers the horses wouldn't cross, and the arrows kept falling. Never stopped, just kept falling like judgment made physical. English longbowmen could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute when properly trained, and there were thousands of archers. Do the math. The arrows punched through armour at weak points, killed horses by the hundreds, struck gaps in helmets, found the vulnerabilities in joints where plate pieces connected. The cavalry charge collapsed before it reached the English lines. Horses screaming and falling, riders thrown into the mud, drowning in armour they couldn't remove. Then the French men-at-arms advanced on foot, thousands of them in full plate armour weighing 60 pounds or more, trying to cross that muddy field. They sank to their ankles, sometimes to their knees with every step. The mud sucked at their boots like it was alive, like it wanted to drag them down. The tight formation, forced by the narrow field, meant they couldn't spread out, couldn't manoeuvre, couldn't fight effectively. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, barely able to lift their weapons, and the arrows never stopped falling. Men collapsed, trapped by mud and the weight of their armour. Others stumbled over them, creating piles of struggling bodies. Those in back pushed forward, toward the English lines, crushing those ahead against the defensive formation. Men were suffocated in the press of bodies, armour trapping them, unable to breathe, dying without ever seeing an enemy up close. The front ranks finally reached the English lines, after an exhausting slog across that hellish field. The fighting became hand-to-hand, brutal, exhausting. But the French were so tightly packed they couldn't fight effectively. Knights in the front couldn't swing their swords properly because allies pressed against them from behind. Those in the back couldn't see what was happening, just kept pushing forward, making it worse. The battle turned into industrial-scale killing. Not a fight, a massacre. French nobles, the cream of their aristocracy, men who'd trained their entire lives for war, died by the hundreds in the mud. The Constable of France, the supreme military commander, 3 dukes, 90 counts and barons, the leadership of France's military establishment, cut down like wheat at harvest. Some drowned in inches of muddy water, weighed down by armour they couldn't remove. Some were crushed under piles of their own dead. Some were beaten to death by English soldiers using mallets and hammers, specifically designed to punch through plate armour. It was butchery conducted with professional efficiency. And then Henry gave the order that history tries very hard to forget, the order that reveals the darkness beneath his legend of chivalry. Kill the prisoners, execute them, all of them. Now, by medieval standards, by the code of chivalry that supposedly governed warfare among nobles, capturing enemy nobles alive was how you became wealthy from war. You held them for ransom, and their families paid enormous sums, sometimes a knight's entire annual income, sometimes more. It was expected, civilized, the gentlemanly way to profit from war. By mid-battle, the English had captured hundreds of French nobles, wounded, disarmed, helpless under guard, worth fortunes, life-changing amounts of money for the common soldiers who'd captured them. But Henry looked across the battlefield and saw French reinforcements approaching from the rear. If those forces attacked and the battle turned, those prisoners could rearm themselves and attack from behind. The English would be trapped between 2 forces, so Henry ordered them executed immediately. Every single one. The English soldiers refused at first. This was insane. You didn't kill valuable prisoners. That was throwing away fortunes, destroying years of potential income. So Henry assigned the task to a specific unit of archers and threatened to hang anyone who disobeyed his direct order. They killed hundreds of French nobles, stabbed them in the throat where armour was thinnest, cut them down where they stood, begging for mercy. Some prisoners were herded into a barn which was then set on fire. Burning them alive was faster than killing them individually. The screaming could be heard across the battlefield. The French were horrified when they learned what had happened. Even English chroniclers, writing years later to glorify Henry, struggled to justify it. They made excuses about military necessity, about the approaching reinforcements, about having no choice, but the truth was simpler and darker. Henry had murdered prisoners of war in cold blood because keeping them alive was inconvenient, because it was tactically risky, because he valued certainty over honour. The final tally of Agincourt was staggering. Perhaps 600 English dead, between 6,000 and 10,000 French dead, depending on which source you believe. It was the most lopsided victory in medieval military history. A battle that should have been an English disaster turned into French catastrophe through a combination of terrain, weather, English discipline, and French overconfidence. Henry returned to England as a conquering hero beyond anything his father had achieved, riding through London in a triumph that rivaled ancient Rome. Parades in the streets, celebrations across the kingdom, poems praising his military genius composed by court poets, songs about the battle sung in every tavern. The impossible victory at Agincourt seemed to prove beyond doubt that God favoured the Lancastrian dynasty, that Henry's claim to France was righteous, that everything his father had done, including murdering Richard II, had been justified by divine approval. But here's what nobody understood at the time. Agincourt was just the opening move, just the first step. Because Henry didn't want to win glorious battles and go home to celebrations. He wanted to conquer France. All of it. To make himself king of France, in fact, not just in claim. And that would require something much darker than battlefield victories. In 1417, Henry launched his second invasion, and this time it was completely different in character and execution. No dramatic marches across France looking for pitched battles. No seeking glory through combat. Instead, Henry employed systematic siege warfare conducted with methodical brutality. Town by town, castle by castle, the slow grinding destruction of French resistance through starvation and terror. Medieval siege law was clear and brutal in its simplicity. If a town surrendered immediately when first summoned, before the siege engines were set up and the investment completed, the defenders and civilians would be treated mercifully. The garrison could leave with honour. Civilians were protected, property was mostly respected. It was civilised warfare conducted according to rules. But if a town resisted, if they forced Henry to spend time and money and lives besieging them, if they made him bring up siege engines and dig trenches and build camps, the rules changed completely. Once a town fell after resistance, medieval law allowed the attackers to sack it. For a set period, usually 3 days, soldiers could rape, murder, and plunder with impunity. It was legally sanctioned terror meant as a deterrent. Resist and your town burns. Your women are violated. Your children are killed. Your churches are desecrated. Surrender immediately and you're safe. Choose. The siege of Caen in 1417 showed Henry's ruthlessness clearly. Caen was a major city, well fortified, the capital of Normandy, filled with civilians and wealth. When it fell after weeks of resistance, Henry allowed his soldiers to sack it as the law permitted. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that still shock modern readers. Civilians killed in the streets without discrimination, women raped in churches they'd fled to for sanctuary, homes systematically looted and burned, merchants murdered for their wealth, even priests violated despite their holy status. Henry stopped the sacking after a few days, restoring order and discipline to his army. But the message had been delivered in blood and screams. Resist me and die horribly. Surrender immediately and live. Every other town in Normandy heard what happened at Caen and had to make their choice. But it was the siege of Rouen that revealed the true depths of Henry's systematic cruelty, the horror that lay beneath his image as a Christian warrior king. Rouen was one of the largest cities in France, wealthy and proud, heavily fortified, fiercely loyal to the French crown, and absolutely determined to resist until a relief army arrived from the south to save them. Henry surrounded Rouen in July 1418 with overwhelming force and settled in for a long siege. He built extensive siege works, dug trenches and earthworks completely encircling the city. No one got in, no one got out. Then he waited with the patience of a man who knew time was on his side. At first, Rouen had ample supplies, grain stores, salted meat. They could hold out for months, if properly rationed, long enough for King Charles to gather a relief army. But as summer turned to autumn, and autumn to winter, and no relief came, supplies ran dangerously low. The defenders realized they couldn't feed everyone through the winter. They had to make a brutal choice. They expelled the useless mouths, anyone who couldn't fight. Women, children, the elderly, the sick, anyone who consumed food without contributing to the defense. About 12,000 people, driven out of the city gates at sword point, families torn apart, elderly parents separated from their children, mothers clutching infants as they were forced into exile. The expelled civilians stumbled out of the city gates, expecting the English to show Christian mercy and let them pass through the siege lines. They were refugees, innocents, non-combatants, covered by all the rules of warfare and Christian charity. Surely King Henry, the pious Christian warrior, would let them leave. Henry refused, ordered his men to prevent them from leaving the siege perimeter. He forced them to remain in the no man's land between the city walls and his siege lines. A muddy ditch maybe 50 yards wide, a strip of hell on earth. They were trapped. The city wouldn't let them back in because that defeated the whole purpose of expelling them. The English wouldn't let them leave because Henry wanted the defenders to watch them die slowly. What followed was one of the most horrific scenes of the entire medieval period, something that haunted even the hardened soldiers who witnessed it. Thousands of people trapped in that ditch with no food, no shelter, no hope, just trapped between two armies, neither of which would help them. They begged the English for bread, reaching through the siege lines with skeletal hands, crying in French and broken English. Henry ordered his men to ignore them, threatened punishment for anyone who helped. They begged the city to let them back in, crying out to fathers and husbands and sons on the walls above them. The defenders refused, couldn't afford to feed them, looked away from the walls to avoid seeing their families die. People began dying within days, from exposure as temperatures dropped toward winter, from starvation as their bodies consumed themselves, muscles wasting, organs failing, from disease as dysentery and typhus swept through the overcrowded refugee camp. Women gave birth in the mud, babies that would never live to see their first week, that died in their mother's arms while English. Soldiers watched from warm camps yards away. Children starved to death watching English soldiers eat their meals just beyond reach. Old people simply sat down in the mud and stopped moving, too weak to go on, too tired to care anymore about survival. Some of the expelled tried to eat grass, dirt, anything. Some went mad from starvation and wandered aimlessly. Some died quietly. Some screamed until they had no voice left. Some English soldiers, horrified by what they were watching, sickened by the screams and the smell and the sheer inhumanity of it all, secretly threw bread over the siege lines at night when their officers weren't watching. When Henry found out, he had the offending soldiers whipped publicly and threatened execution for anyone else who helped. He needed Rouen to break, needed the defenders to see those people die, needed them to understand that resisting him came at a cost that wasn't worth paying. This was war as terror, as calculated psychological torture, as systematic inhumanity designed to break the will to resist through horror. By the time Rouen surrendered on January 19, 1419, most of the expelled civilians were dead. Thousands of corpses lying in that ditch, frozen in grotesque positions or rotting depending on the temperature. The city gates opened, and Henry rode in as a conqueror, past the mass grave of people he deliberately starved, past the evidence of his own ruthlessness. He attended a mass of thanksgiving in Rouen Cathedral, thanked God for the victory, celebrated his triumph as if murdering 12,000 civilians through starvation was something to be proud of. This was the reality of Henry VII's conquest of France, not glorious Agincourt where skill and discipline won the day, but grinding sieges, calculated starvation, terror as policy. Town after town fell not because Henry defeated them militarily, but because he made resistance so horrible that cities surrendered rather than endure what Rouen had suffered. By 1420, Henry controlled most of northern France. English settlers moved in, taking over property, displacing French families. French resistors were hanged or driven out. The conquest seemed complete, but France was also fracturing from within, which helped Henry more than any military campaign. The French nobility was split between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, two factions that hated each other almost as much as they hated the English. They'd been fighting a civil war within France for years, assassinating leaders, massacring supporters, burning each other's territories. When Burgundy allied with England against the Armagnacs, French resistance collapsed. In May 1420, with Burgundian backing, Henry forced the Treaty of Troyes on the mad King Charles VI. The terms were stunning. Henry would marry Charles II's daughter, Catherine of Valois. Charles would remain King of France for his lifetime. But when he died, Henry would inherit both the French and English crowns. Two kingdoms under one ruler. A dual monarchy that would reshape Europe. Charles's actual son, the Dauphin Charles, was disinherited, declared illegitimate, erased from succession. The treaty claimed his mother had been unfaithful, making him a bastard with no claim. Whether true or propaganda didn't matter, the treaty gave France to England. Henry married Catherine in June 1420. She was 19, beautiful, intelligent, but Henry barely knew her. He spent their marriage campaigning, securing his conquests. Catherine fell pregnant quickly. In December 1421, she gave birth to a son at Windsor Castle, Henry, the boy who would inherit two kingdoms. Then in August 1422, while campaigning near Paris, Henry fell ill. The symptoms started slowly, stomach cramps, fever, but they worsened rapidly. Dysentery, the same disease that had killed thousands at Harfleur, the invisible killer that didn't care about crowns. He tried to keep fighting, but his body was done. He couldn't eat, couldn't ride, could barely stand. Fever consumed him. August 31st, 1422. Henry V died at the Château de Vincennes, 35 years old, the greatest warrior king England had produced in generations. Dead from the same disease that killed peasants, he'd conquered France, secured an impossible succession, achieved what everyone thought was beyond reach, and he died before enjoying any of it. Left behind a 9-month-old baby as King of England and France, the curse had claimed its second victim. Henry VI was crowned King of England at 7 years old, crowned King of France at 9. 2 kingdoms, 2 ceremonies, 2 crowns far too heavy for a child's head. Real power divided among regents who spent more time fighting each other than governing. The boy's education was given to monks who raised him to be gentle, scholarly, pious. They told him constantly that he was God's chosen instrument. They emphasized mercy, compassion, Christian charity. They raised him to be a saint. They should have raised him to be a king. By his teens, the problem was obvious. Henry was too gentle for medieval kingship, too trusting. He hated violence, recoiling from tournaments and executions. He preferred prayer to policy, spending hours in chapel while his councils made decisions without him. He founded schools, Eton and King's College, Cambridge, pouring resources into education while his kingdoms burned. He dressed simply, like a monk, reportedly fainted at the sight of blood. These might have been virtues in a monastery. In a king, fatal flaws. Henry was manipulated constantly. He signed documents without understanding them, gave away lands freely, bankrupting the crown, believed everyone meant well, because that's what he'd been taught. Meanwhile, France was collapsing. In 1429, a peasant girl named Joan of Arc claimed God told her to drive the English out. She arrived at Orleans and rallied the French. Within 9 days, the English siege was broken. Who was this girl, blessed or witch? Joan's victories continued. She saw the Dauphin crowned Charles VII at Reims. The legitimacy Henry V had stripped away was reclaimed. English morale shattered. Bedford, Henry's uncle commanding in France, couldn't defeat her militarily, so he destroyed her politically. Joan was captured, sold to the English, put on trial for heresy, May 30th, 1431. Joan burned at the stake in Rouen, 19 years old. The English burned her body 3 times, reducing it to ash. They thought killing her would break French resistance. It made her a martyr, and martyrs are more dangerous than generals. By the 1440s, England was clearly losing. Normandy fell. Bordeaux, held for 3 centuries, fell. English soldiers came home defeated, bitter, dangerous. The treasury was empty, and everyone blamed Henry. In 1445, Henry married Margaret of Anjou, 15 years old, daughter of a powerless French noble. The marriage was supposed to bring peace. Instead, Margaret arrived with nothing, no dowry, no lands. Worse, the treaty secretly promised to return territory to France. Parliament was furious. England had bled for decades, and now Henry was giving it back? For a French princess with nothing? They blamed Margaret. She was French, poor, and she dared try influencing policy. Margaret saw her husband was weak, being manipulated. If she didn't act, everything would collapse. So she became the power behind the throne. England hated her for it. Then in August 1453, something happened that changed everything. Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown. He became catatonic. Couldn't speak, move, recognise anyone. Just stared into nothing. For over a year, England had no functional king. The breakdown was hereditary. His grandfather, Charles VI, had been insane. The madness ran in the family. In October, Margaret gave birth to their son, Edward of Westminster. Henry couldn't acknowledge him, showed no reaction when the baby was presented. Parliament named Richard, Duke of York, as protector. Richard had the best claim after Henry, better bloodline, years of experience. He arrested Somerset, Margaret's ally, reformed the government. But in December 1454, Henry woke up. Suddenly, miraculously. No memory of the lost year. Margaret convinced Henry to dismiss Richard, to exclude him from council. Richard was cast out, terrified. He knew they'd destroy him. May 22nd, 1455, Richard marched on London with an army. At St Albans, violence erupted. Somerset was killed. Henry was wounded. The Wars of the Roses had begun. After St Albans came decades of nightmare. Families destroying each other. Brothers killing brothers. The Red Rose and White Rose, locked in mutual destruction. In 1459, fighting resumed. Richard's army collapsed at Ludford Bridge. He fled to Ireland. His son Edward escaped to Calais. The Lancastrians seemed victorious, but in June 1460, Edward and Warwick, the kingmaker, invaded with professional soldiers. At Northampton, they captured Henry VI, found him sitting in his tent as battle raged, confused and passive. October 1460. Richard of York returned and did something shocking. Walked into Parliament and claimed the throne. Just claimed it. Silence. Even his supporters weren't ready to depose an anointed king. They compromised. Henry would remain king for life. His son would be disinherited. Richard would be heir. Margaret heard the news in Scotland. They'd stolen her son's birthright. She raised an army. December 30th, 1460. Wakefield. Richard was trapped, outnumbered, killed. His body beheaded. His head mounted at York with a paper crown. And his 17-year-old son, Edmund, was captured fleeing. Lord Clifford caught him. "Your father killed mine, now I kill you," stabbed him to death on Wakefield Bridge. Margaret's army marched south, devastating everything. In London, Edward, now Duke of York, heard the news. His father dead, brother murdered. He was 18. He declared himself King Edward IV and marched north. March 29th, 1461. Towton, Palm Sunday. It was snowing. The battle lasted 10 hours. Hand-to-hand combat. So intense men fought until they couldn't lift their arms. The Cockbeck stream filled with corpses. You could walk across on bodies without getting wet. The water ran red for days, 28,000 dead. More than the first day of the Somme, the bloodiest battle in British history. Margaret fled with Henry and their son. Edward IV ruled. He was 19, charismatic, ruthless. For nearly 10 years, England had a strong king, but Edward had a weakness. Edward couldn't stay faithful, and his marriage caused disaster. His main supporter was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker. He'd put Edward on the throne, expected to control the young king. Warwick's plan: marry Edward to a French princess, forge an alliance, rule from behind the throne. He spent months negotiating. September 1464. Edward announced he was already married, secretly, to Elizabeth Woodville. The council was stunned. Elizabeth was unsuitable, a commoner whose first husband had fought for Lancaster, and her family, the Woodvilles, immediately swarmed into power. Grabbing titles, lands, marriages, Warwick was humiliated, his influence shattered. In 1469, Warwick rebelled. Allied with Edward's brother George, Duke of Clarence, they captured Edward, tried to rule in his name. England wouldn't accept it. Edward escaped. In 1470, Warwick fled to France and made the most unlikely alliance in history, with Margaret of Anjou. They hated each other, but they hated Edward more. The deal? Restore Henry VI. Warwick's daughter would marry Margaret's son. September 1470. Warwick invaded. Edward fled to Burgundy. Warwick pulled Henry VI from the Tower. Henry had been imprisoned 9 years. He was confused, barely functional. Henry VI was king again. It seemed the Yorkists were finished. March 1471. Edward landed with a small army. At Barnet, in thick fog, he met Warwick. The fog caused chaos. Lancastrians accidentally attacked each other. The army collapsed. Warwick tried to flee, was caught and killed. The kingmaker died in the mud, but the war wasn't over. Margaret had just landed. May 4th, 1471. Tewkesbury. Edward crushed the Lancastrians. The army broke. Soldiers fleeing into the abbey were dragged out and executed, and Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, 17, the last Lancastrian heir, was killed. Some say in battle, others say captured and murdered by Edward's brothers. Margaret was found hiding, her husband mad, son dead, everything destroyed, and Henry VI back in the Tower. Night of May 21st of 1471, the night Edward returned celebrating, Henry died in his cell. Official cause: grief. Nobody believed it. Henry was murdered, probably by Richard of Gloucester, the last legitimate Lancastrian king, killed to secure the Yorkist throne. The male line was extinct. Edward's second reign should have been secure. Instead, his brother George kept scheming, spreading rumours that Edward's children were illegitimate, drinking heavily, getting erratic. In 1477, after George's wife died, he accused her servant of poisoning her, had the woman executed without authority. January 1478, Edward arrested George for treason. February 18th, George, Duke of Clarence, was executed. Legend says drowned in wine. Edward had killed his own brother. For 5 years Edward ruled peacefully, but he grew massively fat, indulged everything. April 1483, Edward fell ill. Within days he went from healthy to dying. April 9th, 1483, Edward IV died, 40 years old. His heir, Edward VIII, was 12. Edward IV had named Richard of Gloucester as protector. Richard intercepted young Edward at Stony Stratford, arrested the Woodville relatives with him, sent them north, brought Edward to London, housed him in the Tower. Then Richard sent for Edward's younger brother. Richard, Duke of York, 9 years old, was with his mother in sanctuary. Elizabeth Woodville didn't want to give him up, but had no choice. June 16th, 1483. Young Richard joined his brother, the two princes in the Tower, visible in the gardens. Then they disappeared. June 22nd, a sermon was preached. Edward IV's marriage had been invalid. All his children were bastards. Richard of Gloucester was the only legitimate heir. July 6th, 1483. Richard was crowned King Richard III. The princes vanished completely. Rumours spread. Where were they? What happened? The whispers became accusations. Richard had killed them. murdered his nephews. Richard never produced them, never explained. His silence was damning. In 1694, workmen found a box containing 2 children's skeletons buried under a staircase in the tower, assumed to be the prince's, reburied in Westminster Abbey, never properly examined. England believed Richard murdered them, and that belief destroyed him. Richard III ruled just over 2 years, tried to be effective. Legal reforms promoted trade, but the stain never faded. Rebellions erupted. His wife Anne died in March 1485. Richard was grief-stricken, but rumours spread he'd poisoned her to marry his niece. Across the Channel, Henry Tudor was preparing. His claim was absurd, came through his mother, through legitimised bastard lines, explicitly barred from the throne. But England was exhausted, traumatised, desperate for anyone untainted by the wars. Margaret Beaufort made an alliance with Elizabeth Woodville. Deal. Henry would marry Elizabeth of York. Lancaster and York united. August 7, 1485. Henry landed in Wales with 2,000 men, marched through Wales gathering support. By the border he had 5,000. Richard gathered 8,000, 10,000 men. Better equipment, better position, every advantage. But the Stanleys, 6,000 men, watched from the sidelines. Thomas Stanley was Henry's stepfather. Richard demanded they fight for him. They delayed. August 22nd, 1485, Bosworth Field. Richard positioned on high ground. His forces were winning, pushing Henry's men back. Then Richard saw Henry across the battlefield, made an insane decision, charged directly at him. Kill him personally. Richard and his household knights smashed through Henry's guard. Richard killed Henry's standard-bearer, came within feet of Henry himself. 1 more second, and his sword would have reached him. Then William Stanley attacked, not Henry, Richard. Stanley's forces slammed into Richard's flank. Richard was surrounded. Chronicles say Richard fought to the end, shouting, "Treason!" Multiple blows to the head killed him. Richard's crown was found in a hawthorn bush. Stanley placed it on Henry's head. Henry VII, the first Tudor, the last Lancastrian claimant. Richard's body was stripped, slung over a horse, paraded through Leicester, buried in a friary without ceremony. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, the grave was lost. In 2012, archaeologists found his skeleton under a parking lot. DNA confirmed it. His skull showed the killing blows. Found after 527 years, the Wars of the Roses were over. Henry VII married Elizabeth of York. Tudor rose, red and white combined. Propaganda to heal the kingdom. But Henry spent 24 years looking over his shoulder. Pretenders kept appearing. Lambert Simnel claimed to be the Earl of Warwick. Henry defeated him at Stoke Field, the last battle. Showed mercy, making Simnel a kitchen servant. Perkin Warbeck was more dangerous. Appeared in 1490, claiming to be the younger prince from the Tower. For 7 years he had foreign support. Henry finally captured him in 1497, executed him in 1499, along with the real Earl of Warwick, imprisoned since age 10. Judicial murder. Henry ruled until 1509, secured the throne through fear, surveillance, crushing anyone who might threaten him, trusted no one. His son, Henry VIII, inherited security and squandered it through obsession with succession. When Catherine of Aragon only produced Mary, he panicked, broke with Rome, married Anne Boleyn. Anne gave birth to Elizabeth. Henry had Anne executed. Jane Seymour gave him Edward in 1537. Jane died 12 days later. Edward was the golden heir. But when Henry VIII died in 1547, Edward was 9. Another child king, and Edward was sickly. He died in 1553 at 15. Mary I tried to restore Catholicism by burning Protestants. Bloody Mary died childless in 1558, hated. Elizabeth the ruled for 45 years, defeated the Spanish Armada, presided over a golden age but never married, never produced an heir. When she died in 1603, The Tudor line died with her. The crown passed to James VI of Scotland. Not a drop of Lancastrian blood in the male line. The red rose was extinct. The House of Lancaster rose from murder and drowned in blood. Henry IV stole the throne, died rotting at 45, convinced God was punishing him. Henry V conquered France, died at 35 from dysentery, leaving an infant to inherit 2 kingdoms. Henry VI inherited madness, lost his mind, lost both kingdoms, died murdered in a cell. They fought wars that killed tens of thousands. Towton, 28,000 dead in one day. They murdered, schemed, destroyed. And for what? For crowns that never sat easy. For legitimacy they couldn't prove. The Wars of the Roses killed the idea that kingship was sacred. After Lancaster and York destroyed each other, everyone understood. Kings were made by men, by armies, by whoever could hold power long enough. The Tudors learned this. That's why they were paranoid, why they ruled through fear, why every succession crisis carried echoes of Lancaster's fall. The human cost was staggering. Margaret of Anjou fought 20 years and died alone. Elizabeth Woodville watched her sons disappear. Edward of Westminster died at 17. Edmund of Rutland murdered at 17. The princes, 12 and 9, probably murdered. These children never chose, born into the wrong family, killed because they became inconvenient. The House of Lancaster wanted glory. They got a funeral stretched across 3 generations. Henry IV thought he could steal a throne and legitimize it. He was wrong. Henry V thought he could conquer France and be a hero. He built an empire that collapsed. Henry VI thought God would protect him. He lost everything. They got the crown, and it destroyed them. Diseased, young, mad. Not one died peacefully. That's the curse. Not that they failed, but that power consumed them while they held it. The throne became torture. The House of Lancaster is dead, line extinct, but their ghost haunts England. In the Tower where princes disappeared. In Westminster where usurpers lie. In fields where soil remembers. In paranoia that infected every succession. Maybe some families are cursed by their own choices. The House of Lancaster chose violence, and violence destroyed them generation by generation until nothing remained but warning. They built their throne on Richard II's murdered body, and that throne killed everyone who sat on it. Sleep well, and be grateful you'll never wear a crown bought with murder.